Welcome back to Cyberspace, where we use psychology to help you make sense of your world. I'm your host, Leslie Poston. Today, we're diving into a topic that feels particularly relevant: how to take meaningful action when facing seemingly insurmountable challenges. Whether you're dealing with systemic issues, environmental crises, a coup, or profound social change, the scale of these problems can feel paralyzing. But psychological research offers us concrete insight into how small strategic action can create ripple effects far beyond their immediate impact. Let's begin by examining why our brains often shut down when confronting massive challenges. Research in cognitive psychology shows us that when we perceive a problem as too large or too complex, it triggers what's known as learned helplessness, a state where we believe our actions won't matter. However, studies in behavioral activation tell us something fascinating. The very act of taking small concrete steps can break this cognitive paralysis. Consider this finding from organizational psychology. Groups tackling complex problems are most successful when they break down overwhelming challenges into what's called minimum viable actions. These are the smallest possible steps that will move you meaningfully toward your goal. This isn't just about making things easier, it's about creating what psychologist Bandura calls mastery experiences, which build our sense of agency and capability. The concept of self-efficacy, developed through Bandura's extensive research, shows us that these mastery experiences are actually the most powerful way to build confidence in our ability to affect change. His studies demonstrated that people who experience small successes are significantly more likely to tackle larger challenges and persist in the face of setbacks. Before we dive deeper into action strategies, it's vital that we understand how our brains process overwhelming challenges. Thinking all the way back to our first episode, Daniel Kahneman's research on cognitive processing identifies two distinct systems: System 1, fast, intuitive, and System 2, slow and analytical. When facing massive challenges, our System 1 thinking often triggers an immediate stress response, while System 2 becomes overwhelmed by the complexity. Research by Robert Sapolsky on stress responses shows that this cognitive overload can actually impair our ability to think strategically. However, breaking down challenges into smaller components allows us to engage our analytical System 2 thinking more effectively. This is why what organizational psychologist Carl Weick calls small wins can be so powerful. They help us maintain cognitive function under stress and duress. Polsky's research at Stanford particularly illuminated how chronic stress from overwhelming challenges affects our prefrontal cortex, the part of our brain responsible for long-term planning and strategic thinking. His studies show that while acute stress can sometimes enhance decision-making, the kind of chronic stress that comes from facing systemic challenges actually impairs our ability to see potential solutions. However, he found that this impairment can be counteracted through what he calls controllable challenges, small actions where we can see direct results. This finding dovetails perfectly with Week's work on small wins. Recent neuroscience research gives us fascinating insights into why small actions can have such powerful effects on our capacity for change. Studies using fMRI scanning by Matthew Lieberman show that taking concrete actions, even small ones, activates the brain's reward pathways differently than simply planning or thinking about action. This activation creates what he calls neural rehearsal, essentially practicing success at a neural level. Carol Dweck's research on growth mindset adds another important dimension. Her work demonstrates that when people take small successful actions, it triggers changes in neuroplasticity, making the brain more adaptable to future challenges. This creates what she calls a positive feedback loop of growth. Each small success literally rewires our brain to be better prepared for the next challenge. The neuroscience of habit formation, studied extensively by Anne Graybiel at MIT, shows that small actions can create what she calls chunked neural patterns, efficient neural pathways that make future similar actions easier. This explains why starting with small actions can actually build our capacity for larger ones over time. One of the most powerful concepts in social psychology is the idea of behavioral cascades, how small actions can trigger larger changes through social networks. Research by Nicholas Christakis and James Fowler found that behaviors and attitudes can spread through social networks up to 3 degrees of separation. This means your actions don't just affect you, they influence your friends, and even their friends' friends. This network effect has been further validated by Duncan Watts' research on social contagion, which shows how small initial actions can trigger what he calls cascade effects in social systems. His studies demonstrate that these cascades are particularly powerful when they align with what sociologists call latent potential, existing but unexpressed desires for change within a community. What's particularly interesting is how this plays out in crisis situations. Studies of community resilience show that small acts of preparation or resistance often spread through neighborhoods and communities, creating what sociologists call pockets of effectiveness, areas where positive change takes hold and begins to spread outward. Mark Granovetter's foundational research on the strength of weak ties becomes particularly relevant here. His studies show that loose connections between different social groups often prove more valuable for creating systemic change than strong bonds within groups. These weak ties serve as bridges, allowing ideas and practices to spread between different communities. Robert Putnam's work on social capital adds another needed dimension. His research demonstrates that communities with higher levels of social capital, the networks of relationships among people who live and work in a particular society, are more resilient and better able to respond to crises. Small actions that build these connections, therefore, have outsized importance. Belinda Robnett's research on bridge leadership shows how African American women created essential informal networks through daily actions that traditional movement histories missed, fundamentally changing our understanding of how movements grow. Recent work by Mario Small at Harvard has built on Granovetter's insights, showing how what he calls organizational routines, smaller, regular, small-scale interactions in community spaces, create precisely the kind of weak ties that become critical during times of crisis. His research in urban neighborhoods demonstrates that seemingly mundane actions like participating in community groups or regular interactions at local businesses create latent support networks that can be activated when needed. Now, let's talk about how to make your small steps more strategic. Research in social movement shows us that the most effective small actions share 3 key characteristics. First, they're sustainable, meaning you can maintain them over time without burning out. Second, they're connective. They help build relationships and networks that can be activated in times of need. And third, they're scalable. They can be easily adopted and adapted by others. Marshall Gann's work on public narrative and social movements provides a framework for understanding how individual actions connect to larger systemic change. His research shows that effective social movements combine what he calls the story of self, the story of us, and the story of now, connecting personal motivation with collective purpose and immediate action. Consider the historical example of the Montgomery bus boycott. While we often focus on the dramatic moments at the end, it was built on thousands of small, sustainable actions over an extended period of time. People organizing carpools, sharing resources, and maintaining communication networks. These weren't just random acts. They were strategically chosen to build community resilience while challenging the existing system. Alden Morris's research on the civil rights movement revealed how these small actions were part of what he called indigenous organizational strength, sophisticated local organizing systems that earlier researchers had overlooked. Social identity theory, developed by Henri Tachefel and John Turner, helps us understand why small actions can have such powerful effects on group behavior. Their research shows that when people act in ways that align with valued group identities, it can trigger what they call social identity performance, actions that demonstrate and reinforce group membership. Jennifer A. Ricksham's studies on intergroup relations reveal how small positive interactions can help overcome deeply ingrained biases and build collective action across group boundaries. Recent work by Stephen Riker extends this understanding, showing how collective identity can emerge through shared action. His studies of crowd behavior demonstrate that participating in collective actions, even small ones, can strengthen people's identification with social movements and increase their likelihood of future participation. Let's translate all of this research into practical steps. Studies in behavioral science show us that the most effective approach is to create what's called an action framework, a structured way to identify and implement meaningful small steps. Start by identifying what psychologists call your sphere of influence, the areas where you have direct ability to make changes. This might be your workplace, neighborhood, or your social networks. Within these spheres, look for what organizational psychologists call leverage points, places where small changes can have outsized effects. Additionally, look around and see if someone else is already doing this work so that you can join their effort rather than building something competing. Donella Meadows' research on system change identifies 12 types of leverage points, from the relatively weak, quote, changing parameters, to the extremely powerful, quote, changing paradigms. Her work shows that even small actions, when targeted at the right leverage points, can create significant systemic effects. John A. Powell's work on targeted universalism demonstrates how small strategic interventions can create systemic change when designed with an understanding of structural inequities. Frances Wesley's research on social innovation adds practical insights here. Her studies of successful social movements identify what she calls opportunity contexts, moments when small actions can have amplified effects. She found that effective changemakers spend considerable time identifying these contexts, looking for what she calls cracks in the system where modest interventions can trigger larger changes. This might mean identifying policy windows, leveraging moments of public attention, or finding points where existing systems are already under strain. Recent research in the psychology of social movements by Bert Klandermans identifies three key motivational dimensions that sustain long-term engagement: instrumentality, or belief in the effectiveness of action; identity, or connection to others involved; and ideology, alignment with values. Small actions need to address all three dimensions to maintain momentum. Lauren Duncan's longitudinal studies of activists add important nuance to Klanderman's framework. Her research shows that what she calls commitment pathways, the routes by which people maintain long-term engagement, often depend on early small successes that reinforce each of these motivational dimensions. Particularly interesting is her finding that people who start with small, achievable actions are more likely to develop what she terms activist identities that sustain their engagement over decades. This connects with James Jasper's work on the emotional dimensions of sustained activism. His research on what he calls moral batteries, the emotional tensions that drive continued engagement, shows how small actions can help manage the emotional challenges of long-term activism. He found that successful movements typically alternate between what he calls positive and negative emotions, anger at injustice balanced with hope from small victories, fear of consequences balanced with pride in taking action. Deborah Gould's research on emotional sustainability adds another dimension. Her studies of AIDS activism demonstrate what she calls emotional habitus, the emotional culture of a movement, gets built through repeated small actions. She found that movements that consciously create spaces for processing both victory and defeat, celebration and grief, are more likely to sustain engagement over time. The psychological concept of moral elevation, studied by Jonathan Haidt, also plays a key role here. His research showed that witnessing others take meaningful action, even small actions, can trigger what he calls elevation, a positive emotion that motivates similar pro-social behavior. This creates what he terms elevation cascades, where small actions by some individuals inspire others to join in, creating self-reinforcing cycles of engagement. Let's address some common psychological barriers that could prevent us from taking action. Research in cognitive psychology identifies three main obstacles. The first is something called scope insensitivity. or our brain's difficulty in processing large-scale problems. The second is called action paralysis, becoming overwhelmed by too many possible choices. And the third is impact anxiety, worry that our actions won't be enough to matter. Paul Slovik's research on psychic numbing and genocide shows how scope insensitivity can prevent us from engaging with large-scale problems. His work demonstrates that we often respond more strongly to individual stories than to statistics, suggesting the importance of making large challenges personally relatable. Ruth Shem's research on structural competency shows how understanding systemic barriers helps design more effective small-scale interventions that acknowledge and address institutional obstacles. The key to overcoming these barriers isn't to try to solve everything at once. Instead, research in behavioral psychology shows us that focusing on what's called proximal goals, immediate achievable objectives, helps build the psychological resources needed for longer-term engagement. One finding from community psychology is that individual actions become more powerful when they're connected to collective efforts. This is what researchers call collective efficacy, the shared belief in a group's ability to achieve goals together. Maisha T. Wynn's research on justice-centered teaching shows how educational spaces become sites of broader social change through small transformative actions that build collective power. Robert Sampson's longitudinal studies of Chicago neighborhoods demonstrate that collective efficacy is one of the strongest predictors of community resilience. His research shows that small actions that build trust and shared expectations among neighbors can significantly improve a community's ability to face challenges. These small actions play a vital role here because they help build what sociologists call social infrastructure, the networks and relationships that communities need to face challenges together. This doesn't mean groups of people you like either. Don't wait to work with people you like. You need to work with people that are proximal to you with a shared goal. Every time you take a small step that connects you with others working towards similar goals, you're contributing to this social infrastructure. The power of collective efficacy has been further demonstrated in Felton Earle's landmark Chicago neighborhood studies. The power of collective efficacy has been further demonstrated in other studies. Research showed that communities with higher collective efficacy had significantly lower rates of violence, better health outcomes, and greater resilience during crises. What's particularly interesting is that this collective efficacy often started with small localized actions that gradually built trust and shared expectations. Work by Michelle Galfond on tight and loose cultures adds another necessary dimension to our understanding of collective action. Her cross-cultural research shows how different societies develop varying levels of social norms and coordination, affecting how small actions can cascade into larger changes. In what she calls tight cultures, small actions that align with existing norms can have particularly powerful effects in catalyzing change. This approach builds on Grace Lee Boggs' foundational work on dialectical humanism, social movements, while Rinku Sen's research demonstrates how small strategic actions can build effective multiracial organizing. Adrienne Marie Brown's work on emergent strategy, building on both the science of complex adaptive systems and the social justice frameworks of Grace Lee Boggs, offers insights into how small actions create systemic change. Drawing from natural systems, Brown identified several key patterns that make small actions more effective at creating lasting change. First is what she calls fractals, the idea that patterns at small scale repeat at larger ones. In practice, this means the way that we conduct our small actions should embody the larger change we want to see. For example, if we're working toward more democratic systems, our small-scale organizing should itself be democratic. Her research on intentional adaptation shows how successful movements often function like mycelial networks, appearing to spread randomly but actually following carefully evolved patterns of growth and connection. This connects with earlier research on social networks, but adds an important dimension. The most effective small actions are those that create what she calls critical connections, rather than just critical mass. Brown's work particularly emphasizes what she calls nonlinear or spiral growth. The understanding that change doesn't happen in a straight line, but through iterative cycles of action, reflection, and adaptation. This framework helps explain why seemingly small actions can suddenly have massive effects when they hit the right conditions, what complexity theorists call phase transitions. Particularly relevant to our discussion today is her research on resilient adaptation, how small experimental actions allow movements to learn and adapt quickly without risking total collapse. This connects with traditional scientific understanding of complex adaptive systems, but adds more insight about how this plays out in social movements and community organizing. One of the most challenging aspects of creating change is maintaining momentum over time. Angela Duckworth's research on grit provides important insights here. Her studies show that what she calls deliberate practice, regular, focused, small actions, is more important for long-term success than sporadic, larger effort. Teresa Amabile's research on progress principle adds another perspective. Her extensive studies of workplace motivation show that making consistent small progress is more motivating than occasional big wins. She calls this the power of small wins, the idea that regular experience of progress, even minor progress, sustains motivation and engagement over time. This connects with other work on flow states, as we discussed in our recent episode. Flow state research demonstrates that when we engage in appropriately challenging activities, not too easy, not too hard, we enter a state of optimal experience that builds both skill and motivation. Small strategic actions can be designed to create these flow experiences, making sustained engagement with change more likely. As we wrap up today's episode, remember this key insight from psychological research. Meaningful change often starts with what seems like insignificant actions. The key is to make these actions strategic, sustainable, and connected to a larger effort. Your homework this week is to identify one small strategic action within your sphere of influence. Remember, the goal is not to solve every problem at once. It's to start building the psychological and social resources needed for long-term engagement with complex challenges. If you can't identify one small strategic action that you can do on your own, look for places to help other people in your community with their strategic actions. Thanks for listening to this episode of Cyberspace. I'm your host, Leslie Poston, signing off. And remember, even in these overwhelming times, psychology can help us find ways to take meaningful action. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. And as always, and until next time, stay curious.